Superstorm Sandy hammered New Jersey and much of the East Coast with a fury 2 years ago this October. And as might be expected in the wake of tens of billions of dollars in property damage inflicted by the hurricane, the rebuilding is still far from complete. Hello and welcome to After Sandy Rebuilding Safely. I'm your host, Jim Hooker. Now, during the program, we'll look at ways workers, volunteers, and homeowners can protect themselves while rebuilding so they can avoid injury or, worse, a fatality. Now, joining me to help guide us through some of the pitfalls of the rebuilding process are Janice Selinger, Communications Coordinator for Safer After Sandy, a program of the New Jersey Work Environment Council, and Gerry Bonney, Community Disaster Education Specialist for FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and Dr. Winston Kwa, Medical Director for the Mount Sinai Selikoff Centers for Occupational Health at Lower Hudson Valley. And welcome to you all, and thanks for taking the time to come in and talk with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Janice, let's start with you in the New Jersey Work Environment Council and Safer After Sandy. You're on the front lines of this effort to reduce unsafe working conditions and places with the program. Tell us more about some of the unsafe practices that you find out there when you go out into the field.
Well, our project is made possible by OSHA, and it's a Susan Harwood grant for disaster recovery. And what we do is we go out and we train people so that they will not be, so they'll be able to prevent and identify hazards as they rebuild. And part of what we're doing with that is we're going out and we're talking to people about what they're doing out in the field. And what we're finding is that people just sometimes are not realizing that they need to do things a little bit differently. When they're going up on a ladder, they might not have the proper ladder for the work that they're working on.
The ladder could be too short, too long, too...
Right, and they might perhaps not realize that they should have 3 points of contact on the ladder. They should have 2 hands and a foot, or 2 feet and a hand. And they also need to be careful about the kind of clothing and materials that they're using when they're doing this kind of work. Because if someone is going to do work after Sandy or after a disaster, we don't want them to experience a second disaster. The idea is that you don't want to have another problem after you've had a disaster to try to clean up or recover. And so what we hope people are doing, and part of our project is designed to get the word out about using the proper equipment when they go out if they're dealing with mold, to make sure that they're wearing the right equipment, that they've got proper goggles on, that they're using the proper masks, and they're fit tested for those masks. So those are some of the things that we're seeing, that when we go out, that sometimes people are doing the work, wanting to do it quickly, and perhaps saying, oh, well, those goggles are fogging up a little bit, maybe I won't wear them. And not realizing that they're exposing themselves to toxins.
And as you say, sometimes this is in the immediacy of a disaster, and hospitals are already overbooked at the time. Dr. Kwa, right, in terms of folks are in there for fallen tree limbs or exposures or that type of thing. Is that what Janice is talking about, some of the issues that you see in a hospital after a storm or in a rebuilding process in terms of folks either falling off a ladder or cutting themselves with a saw or overexposed to toxins, that type of stuff?
Yes, I think anything that's after a big disaster like this, the hospitals do get the emergency rooms do get flooded with injuries, especially these acute injuries that you do talk about. And I like to also focus on after the acute injury, people develop chronic issues, chronic medical problems, and those may take time, maybe a few weeks after the incident, for people to realize, hey, look, I feel something that's not right with me. I need to get that checked out.
So it's not just that day or that week.
It might not. Yeah, correct.
So you'd want to protect yourself for years to come in terms
That's
of
right.
some of these things, right?
That's right. You never know. You never know.
You know,
Janice, you were gonna say?
one of the things that we ran into is people thought that they were getting, they were taking care of a mold issue because, if there's mold somewhere, they want to address it within 24 to 48 hours. And mold's everywhere. I mean, I think the doctor will be able to
Yes.
address the fact that spores are everywhere and they're not necessarily something that's going to harm you. They're in the environment. But if there's a flood and there's water, you get exposed to that mold, to that toxin. And you think you're taking care of it. And we've had people that have come out to our trainings that we do. We offer free training on identifying and preventing hazards. And when we have people coming out, they say, oh, I cleaned that up. I took care of that problem. Why is it back? Well, it was behind the wall. It was under the floor. And now people are starting to get sick from that exposure.
And Gerry, we understand that FEMA has heard about some myths that people have in terms of whether they've cleaned up, as Janice says, they believe what are some of those myths that they have that, they've cleaned up the mold, they really haven't, bleach works, it
Right.
doesn't. Can you give us any thumbnails on those?
Bleach works.
Bleach
Doesn't work. And
Okay.
here's why.
Okay.
Because if it's a porous material, then there's no way that bleach is going to get in there and kill this mold. An interesting thing that...
Porous material being like a sheetrock or...
Exactly. Any kind of paper, wood, that kind of thing. And then what happens is, like a wick, that will suck into the wall, into the your fiberglass inside of the wall, your insulation. And once that gets in there, if you don't see it, you might have cleaned the mold off on the front, but it's growing back behind. And what you don't realize is as time goes on, people are getting sicker and sicker, and you're smelling something terrible, and you don't realize that it's festering behind that wall.
And the bleach doesn't get sucked in with it to kill it off inside there? Or
No, does not. As a matter of fact, one of the worst things that people do is try to use straight bleach. And using straight bleach is terribly wrong. And the reason is because the molecular structure of bleach actually prevents it from soaking through the porous material. It won't even get in there. That's why if you're going to use bleach on anything, it should be a solid surface, like for glass or tile or
kitchen
something.
tile or
But you
granite.
still have minuscule little pores that it's got to get down into. That's why you mix 1 cup of bleach to 1 gallon of water. That's the perfect solution to allow it to get into those pores and to let that bleach kill that mold that's there. But it's not going to get rid of it in any kind of a porous material.
The doctor, who's a respiratory specialist as well, right, is shaking his head saying, yep, this is true.
Yep, I have to agree with exactly what you said.
In terms of you've seen patients come to you who have, say, Gerry says it needs the bleach, they feel like they've cleaned it up, and he says they get sicker and sicker.
Correct.
Do you see them come to you at some point down the road where, heck, doctor, I cleaned up my house, my apartment, and now I'm sick?
Yes,
What?
I do. And one of the major issues is that when someone gets exposed to the mold, and they could be exposed to the mycotoxins released by the mold itself, it depends on the individual themselves. If they're sensitive to the mold or the toxin, they can get really sick. They can develop, like if they do have asthma, the asthma can worsen. Or even if they don't have asthma, they may develop breathing issues because of that exposure. It can trigger something in their immune system that makes them more sensitive.
And I suppose my own household, my wife, very sensitive to molds, and me, not so much. But you've seen the actual documentation, as it were, with the different patients, or someone comes in and they're in a real bad way, and somebody else maybe had the same exposure in the same home and not touched it all. Is that right?
Yeah, and they will be perfectly fine. And like I said, it depends on the person themselves.
So then how would you know in terms of whether you've done a good job in a cleanup if the one person who's not really affected is fine, and then the other person, I suppose, person becomes the canary in the coal mine, as it were? Or?
That's right. Unfortunately, the only way to tell if the cleanup has been successful, is to do air sampling testing.
So you can test. It doesn't have to be on a person.
No, it doesn't have to be on the person. It's done where the mold exposure occurred, and you can actually do air sampling testing. And what that entails is that you compare the amount of mold spores or the amount of mold concentration in that particular space to what it is outside. So we use the control is the outside concentration. And if their numbers are particularly high in that area still, that's mean the cleanup has not been successful.
You still got to go back at it.
Even though you don't see anything.
One more thing before we go back over to Janice and Gerry. The black mold versus, say, the green mold. People say the black mold is really terrible and really going to get you. Is that true, or is that a myth? Or?
People have actually looked into this black mold, gray mold. What you're talking about is the stachybotrys mold, which is the black mold, which it releases mycotoxins. A lot of studies have been done to look into just to see if it does cause any sickness. Unfortunately, there's not too many studies that actually found that it caused any.
That black mold is any worse than the other mold?
It looks
ominous.
Pretty much, yes.
When you see it on a wall or a basement.
Correct. But I would like to say is that it depends on the person that is exposed. So some people can be exposed to the black mold and be completely fine, while others can get really sick.
Any idea why that is?
Right now we don't know at this time, but I think it's something innate in that person. They might have something that makes them more vulnerable to the toxin or more reactive to that particular agent that we don't know about at this point. But what I like to point out is that the mold that grows indoors from the flooding, from water damage, they actually looked into what the types of mold that grows there, and do they make toxins or mycotoxins. And they found that a significant amount, almost close to 100% of these molds do produce some type of toxin compared to
and that's
the
the
regular
kind
outside.
of molds we're talking about.
And that's what we're talking
rebuilding.
about. So they have looked into that.
And Janice, in terms of protections, you talked about protections earlier. There's certain masks that we see, say, in some of your in your promotionals that are done by your program.
Yes, part of our project is we produce public service announcements about identifying and preventing hazards, and some of them deal with mold, and some of them deal with generators and safe use of ladders. And what we found, and it's true with a lot of the workers that are out there, is that it's very important that they're using masks, and the minimum is that N95 mask. And what the situation...
Which one? That's the one with just a little, no?
It's a mask that goes in...
Just a little aluminum bar here and not the breathing sides? Or?
Right, they have, those are better to have when you have the canisters.
Yeah,
yes,
but it depends, because like what you said, it depends. The mask has got to say it's an N95 mask.
Oh,
it could look like just a regular dust mask, but as long as it's an N95 mask.
Oh, that's some sort of screening that's in there or something?
Correct.
Right, but what's important about it is that it's fit tested, and that's what a lot of people do. They'll say, okay, well, I have this N95 mask, or I have the one with the canister, so I'm really prepared because I have this really good mask. But if it's not fit tested, it really doesn't help. And the other situation is if you have facial hair, you can't wear a mask like that because it can't be fit tested properly. And so the mold spores can get in. And so what's the point of wearing it at that point?
Does that preclude a guy with a beard, say, from being in that type of business? Or maybe if he's got the system, the immune system, he's okay. But what are your thoughts on that?
Generally, they're not supposed to be doing that kind of work. I mean, is that correct from what you've seen?
That is correct. Because our goal is to protect the worker and to protect the person. We don't want to risk that. Risk that exposure, so that's why they need to be fit tested.
So generally, they have to wear the mask and they have to be fit tested by OSHA regulation.
The fit testing it's done by OSHA regulation.
Done by
correct?
OSHA. Okay.
Yes.
But to the end of what we're talking about here, the way FEMA looks at it is really and truly you should go by the 10 to 100 method before you start tackling a mold project yourself. If it's within 10 square feet, it's something that's manageable, then you can probably do it yourself. If you're between 10 square feet and 100 square feet in that neighborhood, time to start getting some professional input. If it's over 100 square feet, then you need to let the professionals come in and do this. This is not a job for the local handyman or handywoman. This is something that a person who knows mold, who understands mold, and has worked with it and is a true professional, those should be the only people dealing with this because of the health factor and because you want to make sure you get the right job done for the money.
And where do you how do you go about finding those folks? Yellow pages, what they used to call the yellow pages, or does FEMA provide guidance in that area?
Actually, we really don't, because we really don't endorse any particular groups, organizations, or what have you, businesses, I should say. But what you do is everything from word of mouth to internet, but do your homework and make sure whoever you get has references and they've got a background and that they're insured.
Mm-hmm. That's how you know it to be as well, Janice?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think the other thing that's important to realize is that a lot of times people do try to volunteer. And with recovery after Sandy, there were a lot of volunteers, there were a lot of homeowners that were doing this kind of work, and it was great to have them do that. And what we find with some of the things that we're doing, we're offering this free training that is open to volunteers and homeowners and workers. But sometimes volunteer groups would say, well, we really don't have the time. The volunteers are only in for the day and they're going to go do the work and they don't have the time to do that. And then what they're finding, there have been a couple of studies that have been done where they found that sometimes volunteers are getting hurt. And in some cases killed. So it's really important to make sure, I think with a lot of this, that the people, are aware of the proper, way to do the work and when to get professional help when they need it.
You have a new workers program also, right, where you pick folks go out onto jobs?
Oh, that's not from our organization, but I had mentioned that there's a Susan Harwood disaster grant, and that goes to a number of organizations, and one of them is called New Labor.
New Labor,
And
right.
New Labor also got a grant from OSHA. And what they do is they work primarily with the Latino population, but with low-wage workers. And they go out to street corners and they actually do some of the training as some of the workers are waiting to be picked up to go out on jobs. And it's very important because they find that they can train them, where they're waiting, before they go out, and try to give them some important information about ladders and safe use of scaffolding, so that they're not falling off of roofs when they're doing this important work.
Right, and while that's a program, New Labor, you also, as you said earlier at the very top of the show, you also provide that type of training. If you're a homeowner or a volunteer, you can go to your program as well and get that type of training.
Right.
As to 3 points on a ladder, and something that I don't know that we've touched on yet, but I know you're big on, which is the proper use of generators, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well,
if you would.
one of our public service announcements takes a look at generator use, and what was really kind of surprising is that people think that if they can open the window or open the door a little bit, that they'll be okay, and they'll leave the generator inside. And there were instances in New Jersey, some right in Middlesex County, where people died because they had the generator running after Hurricane Sandy. And earlier this year, there was an ice storm in the Midwest and northeastern Canada where some people were killed because of that exposure. And I think the doctor could certainly talk about what happens to a body with an odorless and tasteless gas like carbon monoxide.
Good point. Tell us about that, doctor, if you would.
Unfortunately, carbon monoxide is an odorless. You won't detect it until it's too late.
Because you would think with the generator running, it has maybe an exhaust, right?
It's got an exhaust.
So would you smell the exhaust? But
if it's hopefully,
Janice is right. There were three
Yep.
deaths actually that were cataloged in New Jersey as a result.
Sometimes you won't be able to smell it, and what happens with carbon monoxide poisoning is that you don't sense it. What it makes you feel is that you get more tired, you get more sleepy. And then as the exposure increases or the concentration increases on where you're breathing, you just typically fall asleep. And once that happens, it's too late.
It's over, right?
It's over, yeah.
Yeah.
So
go ahead.
I always like to point out that it's so important, even though like some people may think that having the generator outside it's safe, but you have to make sure that it's not in anywhere the air intake valves are sometimes. Because sometimes they might have some air conditioning system where it draws air in. And if you got the generator right there with the exhaust and the air is coming in from there, that's another issue.
As you can imagine,
Correct.
that probably has happened more than we'd like to think
Yes.
about, right? And Gerry, you're all over the country with your agency seeing these types of situations. Is this something that folks really need to learn about in terms of the handling of the generator and doing that properly to avoid these sorts of fatalities that we're talking about?
Well, we
injuries?
certainly do hope that people will, well, basically observe common sense, because that's what it sort of boils down to, actually. But as far as guidelines as to usage of things of that nature, that's something that we really don't get into. One of the things that we do hope that people will understand is that when we start talking about generators, we start talking about other energy, this kind of thing, that's something that we get involved in providing grants to locations to be able to actually put these machines into places like hospitals and these types of places. So our job is to sort of put them there, but then when you have folks like OSHA who are there to make sure that they're safely used.
They can do great good. They can also do great harm, right, if used in the wrong way. And
That's correct.
Janice, Gerry mentions OSHA. Was there a phone number or two that you wanted to put out, or
Yes,
different?
yes.
Sure.
In New Jersey, there are actually several local offices that people, if you're a worker and you have an issue, there's a safety issue or a health issue, you can contact an office in Avenel, in Marlton, in Parsippany, and in Hasbrook Heights. And there's also on our public service announcements, there's an 800 number that we have for OSHA, which is the general 800 number, which is 1-800-321-OSHA, which is 1-800-321-6742. And there's also, if you're a public employee, there's also PIOSH, which is the public employees version of OSHA for people that work for the state of New Jersey.
So another place to turn. And maybe if you just have a question, maybe the employer isn't necessarily doing something in a nefarious way. Maybe they don't realize it, right, doctor? Or?
They may not. Sometimes
you-
the employer may not realize certain things that like some certain things that should not be done, but employers are not trained at this. That's why you have OSHA if they have any questions,
Right.
and they could definitely call them if they have any issues or questions about safety.
Now, your field of expertise is occupational health. So what kinds of injuries do you see occurring most frequently, would you say, in relation to rebuilding projects of the kind we're discussing here post-Sandy?
So we do see a lot, and we talked about the musculoskeletal injuries that occurs right after an end of this event like this. But afterwards, I do see a lot of cases in terms of respiratory cases, a lot of asthma cases that do get worsened, or bronchitis cases. And I also see a lot of what we call chronic rhinitis, sinusitis cases.
That's too big a medical term for us.
So I'm going to
give us an explanation
yes.
if you would. Thank you.
So what that means is that a lot of people, the first thing before you even develop breathing issues is you might get sinus infections up here, nasal congestion right here, and because that's the first, that's the first barrier that before it enters your lungs, that's where the mold or mold spores or any kind of irritants enters. So this is the first place that will get irritated first, and some people will just complain, hey, I have bad allergies, or like, why am I so congested? And they develop headaches sometimes. It could develop into infections, fevers that need treatment with antibiotics, things like that. And after that, they typically progresses, and you could develop into breathing difficulty, shortness of breath. Other issues that I tend to see also with patients that have typical mold exposures is that they develop these neurological symptoms in which they feel very fatigued, or they feel like they're mentally drained.
And some of it, let's say we discussed the mold earlier, but let's say you misuse the bleach because sometimes you can get too close to cleaning stuff. Is that something that also happens to folks in terms of just the very solvents themselves that they're trying to?
Correct, yeah, because
You
once
see
you
some of
use, people think, like you said, you have to dilute the bleach. But if they see mold, they feel like, oh, let me just try and get rid of it.
And then is there some sort of vapor or something that overtakes a person?
It does, and it's the key point that I like to point out is that a lot of people may know this, may not know this, but you do not want to mix bleach with ammonia-based products. Because once that happens, that's the vapor that you're talking about, is that it can make you very sick.
Right.
It's what you will call like a cyanide component of gas. that's being released.
Could
So
you be
it is-
overcome by that and
Yes, you can
fall
be
and
very easily overcome by that. Because typically you would think that where the place that the mold exposure occurred probably does not have good ventilation already. So there you start using these cleaning agents that can't off gas or can't be released into the air. It's all concentrated in that one small location, and you're working there.
And
So
you've
your
seen
exposure-
this
yeah, I've seen some
probably
cases
more
of
than
this.
you'd like to see, right?
Yes.
But Jim, I want to add something here to what the doctor's saying, because we're talking about individuals and we're talking about how they get sick from mold. But there's another safety factor here with mold, and that is if the mold gets into the structure of your home and you don't see it and it has time to work on that, it eventually will weaken the integrity. And so eventually you may not know it. You may be smelling something and not realize that you've got a mold problem, but you could end up having some sort of a problem with part of your wall caving in or something that happened, or a stud or something fall, or hurt a member of your family. So it's as much a safety factor in that aspect as it is from what the doctor's talking about.
You must be reading my mind, Gerry, because I was going to ask you, what do you find most people are most unaware of in terms of safety, keeping themselves safe, and that's one of them, I suppose.
Absolutely,
in terms of the fact that,
absolutely, and that's why what we look at in my department is mitigation, and that basically means to prepare, and that means so get ready for the next storm. We've had one storm, and the number one disaster that we deal with, time and again, regardless of what it is flooding. Flooding is number one.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter if it's a hurricane, it doesn't matter if it's a tornado and it's just followed by a thunderstorm or what have you. Once the integrity of a home or structure has been violated and that moisture can get inside, then you've just opened the door for mold to do its thing, which is why we have elevation projects, acquisition projects, and other things that programs that we strongly push.
and that's what you're doing to mitigate into the future, as you're saying.
We say be prepared for the next one. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when.
It's almost like in the Army where you're fighting the next war or the last war. I forget how that goes anyway. It's probably not like that at all. So, but Janice, you've been out filming various Sandy rebuilding projects all around. And what do you see when you're on site there? Have you actually come across some of these things that you're talking about and the others in terms of ladders that aren't set up right or scaffolding that might be shaky or...
We have, and we've also seen, primarily a lot of people that still have mold, and it's surprising 2 years later, that it's still
That
there,
does surprise,
and
yeah.
that some cases they think they took care of the problem and now it's back. I think the other thing that we're finding that is really kind of surprising is what people are doing that they might not realize is a dangerous thing to do. And when we do the training, we do this hazard mapping exercise where we have people sit in groups, and it's really interesting because it's interactive. And so they sit in a group and they, draw a picture of their house or they draw a picture of their workplace and the hazards that are there. And we had a woman that was doing that, and she just, starts talking about her house, and she talks about the fact that she washes her kids, she gives them baths in bleach. And she uses the bleach on her dishes.
Yikes.
And that's what we all said. We all were like, whoa. And you just don't, you just don't know what do you say to that? It's just so it's important to provide that kind of information so that people understand, we train about mold and the hazards of mold, but a lot of it is also just understanding, what you have in your home and what things shouldn't be placed together and what could be dangerous to use.
I'll tell you, you think you've heard it all, and then you
know.
hear that.
I hear that. That's a first.
Well, hopefully that practice ends, right, Janice? So before we leave, as we're running down a little bit on time here, if you all had one piece of advice to a worker, a volunteer, a homeowner in terms of avoiding injury while rebuilding, for our viewers, what might that be? Want to start with you, Janice? Put the onus on you with the Safer After Sandy program? Or?
I think it's just to be aware and, you know, before you tackle a project, to make sure that you're protecting yourself so you don't have a future disaster. So I think to just be aware of where you're walking into, you know, if it's debris, that could be a problem. Worry about electrocution, you know, worry about exposure to mold. Just make sure that you're, you know, you want to help. And it's great that people want to help, and we want people to be prepared to do that. But you don't want someone to injure themselves by doing that.
Right, and then as we said earlier, you know, clogging up the hospital emergency rooms even further. But you made some good points too about the foggy goggles and just throw the ladder up and go ahead up there. And so it's important, I suppose, to double check and make sure you're doing everything safely. Take your time, I guess I'm saying.
Absolutely.
From what you said earlier. Jerry, how about yourself?
Education. It's learning, and knowledge is power. And we have a plethora of information. You can go to FEMA.gov, you can go to ready.gov, floodsmart.gov, and there are virtual libraries of publications and books that will cover just about any aspect of any program that FEMA has. And so whether you live on the coast or whether you live by a big ditch, it doesn't make any difference. We've got a book and a pamphlet for you which can help. So do your homework ahead of time and be prepared.
Okay, Dr. Kwa?
So, just one note is that if you feel like there's something wrong with you, and just discuss this with your doctor, let your physicians know, let your doctor know, and and maybe your doctor may not be aware, but we are out there, occupational medicine specialists, who this is our specialty here. To determine the cause of an illness, or determine if what's making you sick.
Great idea. Go in and see a medical professional.
Yes.
Right? Okay. On that note, that's all the time we have. So, Janice, Communications Coordinator, reintroduce everybody one last time to our viewers. Communications Coordinator for Safer After Sandy, a program of the New Jersey Work Environment Council. Gerry Bonney, Community Disaster Education Specialist for FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and Dr. Winston Kwa, Medical Director for the Mount Sinai Selikoff Centers for Occupational Health, Lower Hudson Valley. And thank you all for being here and sharing such sound advice, and hopefully we'll be avoiding some accidents and things into the future as a result. So that is it for After Sandy, Rebuilding Safely. I'm your host, Jim Hooker. Thanks for joining us.